Welcome to Passionate World Talk Radio. Educate, enlighten, entertain.
This show does not provide medical advice. If you're having a medical emergency, please call 911. Anything you hear here should be discussed with your primary health care provider. Hello and welcome to Everyone Dies, the radio show produced by Passionate World Talk Radio, whose goal it is to educate, enlighten, and entertain. I'm Marianne Matzo, and for the next 30 minutes, I am your host. So, you guys know I retired about a year ago, but, sometimes the people from my old life sneak back in, and they'll say, you did some research with us on this paper, and now this paper's going out. So I got an email message from my colleague named Susan, and so I responded to her with our Everyone Dies email, and she answered me. She said, "That sounds interesting. What are you doing?" And she told me about it. She said, my friend just wrote a book on death and dying. And so she hooked the two of us up, and today we get to speak with Susan's friend, Lori Erickson, and she wrote a book called Near the Exit, Travels with the Not-So-Grim Reaper. So, Lori, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. Our interests certainly align. It's a great service that you're providing to people to talk about these issues from a variety of perspectives. So I'm happy to add my 2 cents.
Well, I was so excited. I don't know. I really don't think I would have ever found you, Lori, if Susan hadn't told me about you. So I guess in a nutshell, what happened is that Lori got a call that her brother had died suddenly, and I'm sorry for that loss, Lori. And at about the same time, her mom was needing to go into a care facility for Alzheimer's. And in those kind of two intersections, set off on a quest, that's my word, not hers, but to set off on a quest to learn about how do we live with death. And, can we really blend death with all of the other parts that go with it, remembrances, religions, the opportunity for spiritual growth. And so I laugh, Lori, because it's like, God, I envied you as I was reading this book. So she took off on trips all over the world to learn about this. So is anything that I just described not true?
Oh no, that's a good summary of the book. Yeah, I might just add that I am a travel writer by profession. I've written about destinations around the world for a number of decades now, and I have a particular specialty in writing about travel and spirituality, so holy sites, pilgrimages, things like that. And so part of my reaction to those losses in my life, my brother's death and my mother going into a memory care unit, was to look to travel for inspiration, because it has always been such a source of fascination for me and such a source of impetus for spiritual growth. And so I got to thinking about the ways in which travel could teach me about mortality. And so some of these destinations I had visited before, and I looked back on them through that lens of mortality. And then there were some new trips that I did as well.
And so how did you choose the places that you were going to go?
Well, I knew from the beginning of the book project that I wanted it to be a mixture of places that were just fascinating in and of themselves. So, for example, Egypt, the Valley of the Kings, the Great Pyramids. There's a chapter on Mexico and Guatemala and the Day of the Dead tradition. And so I wanted to have sort of those fascinating, faraway places. But then I also wanted to write about places that are much more part of people's ordinary experiences. And so the chapters alternate between a trip that I take and then also a more universal destination. So one of them is the nursing home where my mother lived. Another is graveyards. Another is funerals. Another is hospice. So I hope to sort of interweave sort of the faraway perspective and then a closer to home perspective in the book. But those places, that seemingly ordinary places, I wanted to look at from the perspective of really a travel writer. And so, for example, the nursing home where my mother lived, it was memory care. So of course there was a locked entrance at the front of it, and I got to thinking about the ways in which it was like a foreign country. It's like passport control. You can't go easily through the border. And once you're in a memory care unit, it has its own culture, its own time zone, its own food, its own, and a real sense of timelessness there. And that really helped me in visiting my mother for the years that she was in. That was her home, to sort of draw on the skills that I had learned from traveling to countries around the world and encountering cultures quite different from mine, to try to use those same skills in relating to her in what really was a foreign country for me.
Did you, in those visits with your mom, ever talk with her? I mean, I understand about dementia, but did you ever talk with her about how this is like a foreign land?
No. By the time she got to that place, she really wasn't capable of having a conversation of that sort. Yeah. But ironically, and I write about this in my book, that especially the first couple of years she was in the memory care unit, those were really good years for us in the sense that my mother had been a pretty anxious person and had really retreated into herself and worried a lot about things. And once she was in that place where she was taken care of and the staff was really good to her, I think she really enjoyed it. And when I came to visit her, there was a kind of openness and ease and pleasure in each other's company that had not been there actually for quite a long time. And so I considered it a tremendous gift, those first couple of years that my mother was in a nursing home. It really, healed some of the frayed edges of our relationship. And so I'm grateful for that opportunity.
Yeah, and I've seen that happen. I had nursing students on an Alzheimer's unit, and you could see that with Alzheimer's, for example, that there's kind of two ways they go. Either
two ways it can go. Yes,
and
it
was always surprising. Like I remember this one man saying, his wife was a judge. And he said, she uses words I didn't know she knew. It's like, yeah, I guess she must know them, because she just really turned into a she-devil at one point of her Alzheimer's. Yeah. And then there would be daughters who would say, I've always had a difficult time with my mother, but this woman, whoever she is, she's really nice, and I like her. And they, she just, I can remember this woman saying, I just feel better, because she can, in her mother's body, have this nice woman and not the she-devil that she lived with, that she grew up with. And so it's always been fascinating to me.
Yeah. I found it fascinating too. And I could see both those sets of stories playing out in the memory care unit and on my visits to her. And I would say I was more in the latter camp with my mom. So it was a real gift in its own way. Yeah.
Now, in your travels, you write about reincarnation. that idea of becoming someone else, which is really what we're talking about in terms of Alzheimer's, is that, you know, nobody asks you to become somebody else, but this disease, you know, messes with our brains and leads it to the point where we are somebody else. And so how do you think all of that is decided? Have you come to any thoughts about reincarnation and how we get to be somebody else?
That's a very good question, and then I think it's you know, I want to give a fairly complicated answer to it. So I would first of all say that my book is called Near the Exit, and that was a very deliberate choice. It's not after the exit, it's near the exit. And so I really wanted to concentrate on what people can learn, what I learned from contemplating that very last stage of life, whether you're in it yourself or you're seeing someone else go through it, you're anticipating your own. Because I think it's such a rich, rich time, philosophically and spiritually. At the same time, I don't think you can look at that period without wondering if there's anything that comes after death, and if so, what it is. And so I consider myself very much a spiritual person, and I range quite widely in my beliefs, even though I have my feet planted in Christianity, but I've wandered in a lot of different faiths in my life and remain open to inspiration from a lot of different traditions. And so I think personally, my sort of intuition, if I had to say what I believe, I would say I think we come back in some kind of form, and so a version of reincarnation, I would say. But that's, you know, I can't prove it, and, you know, it's just sort of, and maybe it's just wishful thinking, but I think I would say if I had to choose what happened to me, I really would like to come back again, because it's such a grand gift to be given life. And I'd really like to come back with, you know, some of the lessons that I learned and maybe the chance to, you know, work on the things I didn't learn. And so
to be able to remember the lessons, that
well, you know, at some level, maybe. Yes, yeah. And there are various traditions, you know, some say yes, that's possible, and some say no. I do think that one of the people that I quote in my book that was really influential in how I think about end-of-life issues is a writer, Kathleen Dowling Singh, Singh, and not sure if you're familiar with her. She has died maybe 2 or 3 years ago. She's a Buddhist teacher who also worked in hospice for many years, and she wrote 2 absolutely wonderful books. One is called Grace in Aging, and the other is Grace in Dying. And she said something at the beginning of the Grace in Dying book that I quote in my book that is so simple and yet I think so important. And she said, if I could tell you just one thing, she said, you don't have to read the rest of my book, but this is the message I want to get across. She said, from having observed so many deaths, being part of this process with so many people, she said, death is nothing to fear. You know, you will be taken care of. You will be surrounded by light. I can't remember her exact words, but just this sense of reassurance that we shouldn't fear death. And then the rest of that, or the rest of her book is, you know, she elaborates on that central theme from a Buddhist perspective, but I think anyone can relate to the sorts of things that she talks about. She talks about the process of dying as a process of natural spiritual enlightenment, that even if we've avoided these issues our entire life, we will go through them at our end, except, of course, if, you know, if we're hit by a bus or something like that happens really, really quickly. So I believe that too, that whatever happens, it's okay, you know, that it's nothing to fear.
Well, I think that in watching many people die as a hospice nurse, being at their side, that I don't disagree with that at all. And in fact, it's sort of a little bit underwhelming. I've had nursing students who kind of said, this is it. It's like not the big event that they were planning on. It's like, honey,
well, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry the angels didn't show up playing their harps, but yeah, this is it. But then for many people, there's the fear of what happens after their eyes are closed and their heart stops. It's that fear of the unknown of, well, okay, so now do I, believe the Bible that I will be, severely punished and spend my days in hell.
Oh,
and I've had patients who were totally frightened about what would happen to them because of things that they had done. And they didn't want to talk to a priest, and they didn't want that. That was not where they felt their forgiveness would come. One guy who, multiple times cheated on his wife, and she wasn't going to come to see him. He said, she won't come. I said, well, do you want to tell me, like as if I were her, do you want to tell me what you did? And he said, okay. And so he told me, these things he did. And I put my hand on his shoulder afterwards. I said, in the name of women, I forgive you.
Wow.
And I didn't know if that was cheesy or what, but his mind was at peace.
Well, I think you gave him the message that he needed to hear. Yeah.
Well, but the thing is that many of our religions have that fire and brimstone pattern to them that really does scare people, right? And then finding a way to heal people before they, before they die, so that they can have some comfort. Have you, in your travels, are there customs or rituals of forgiveness? Like the Catholic Church has theirs, but what other ones have you found?
Oh, I think that is a universal phenomenon, actually, the sense of unfinished business of one sort, of something that's hanging heavy on your spirit. And I think that there are certainly time-honored rituals relating to that, confession or, meeting with some kind of faith leader of some sort, someone who can, in a sense, give absolution from something larger. But I think too often that, first of all, I think people often punish themselves for what they've done. The seed may come, or the reinforcement may come from hearing about traditions or doctrine in faiths, but often the real punishment comes from guilt that they have, and that is their own personal burden. And I think that confession is good for the soul, whether it comes in the form of a medical professional who has the kindness to realize that that's the kind of care that the person needs. And I've heard of, I'm sure you have had this happen too, of phone calls that take place, at the end of people's lives, of people who reach out to estranged relatives or to call someone to ask for forgiveness. Ira Byock has a really nice book. The 5 things that matter most, and see if I can recall them. One is to say I love you. One is to say, will you forgive me? Another one is to say I forgive you, and then one of them is thank you. And I'm forgetting the 5th one, but I do think
the 5th one is goodbye.
Oh, goodbye. Yes. Yeah, you're familiar with his work. He's great. But I really like that idea of both asking for forgiveness and granting forgiveness at the end of your life, because I think that gets to the heart of making peace. And I think it's also an argument for not dying suddenly, that it's good to have the chance to tie things up, and to lay down those burdens of guilt or of anger, of hardness of heart. And I think that is really an essential part of the dying process. And I think most people get to that point. Not everyone does, but I think most people do.
I think that they can, certainly, if they're able, as you said, to lay down some of the crap they're carrying around. Like if you're one of these people who is, really hell-bent on, I'm right and you're wrong, it's hard, and sometimes it does fall to the nurse to say, we don't have a lot of time here.
Yeah.
Are you sure this is how you want it to end? Right. And because there's that, especially an American view of, I got forever, dude. Don't be harassing me,
There's always something more that could be done,
Right. Well, or that I'm not going to die. I've had people that I've had in hospice who they enter the active dying part. They'll say, am I actually dying now? It's like, yeah, it's like, it's just kind of surprising to me when I'm asked questions like that, because, you want to say, you're in hospice, what do you think you've been doing?
Yes.
I'm just always so grateful that what goes on in my brain stays in my brain.
I heard Dr. Ira Byrak give a presentation, and I remember one story in particular. He talked about helping a family whose 95-year-old mother was dying, and the family was so distraught and kept talking about the tragedy of it all. And instead of seeing it as, well, this person is 95 years old. This is not a tragedy. This is part of an inevitable process that everyone, if you are awake at all, realize this is where it all ends. And so is that a tragedy? I don't think so. But he didn't say that either, because, people have, they have the right to the grief that they're experiencing. But what we were talking about, though, one of my favorite lines that I quote in my book comes from Richard Rohr, who is a spiritual writer, author, Franciscan priest. And he wrote, I heard him say, he gave a presentation on some kind of topic. I can't even remember what it was. And in the question and answer period afterwards, there was a hospice volunteer who raised his hand and asked him, he said, why do you think so many people have so much problems facing death? And Richard said, you don't want to leave your spiritual homework until the night before the test. And I really like that. He said, it's such a homely kind of metaphor. It is a kind of homework, I think, to get ready for the end of life. And a lot of people think that either it doesn't need to be done at all, or that they can keep putting it off. And I think all the great spiritual traditions, all the great wisdom traditions say, no, if you do that homework all along, if you do it well in advance of when that test comes, your life is better because of it. It's not just that the end of your life is going to be better. It's that your present life will be better, because you will realize that you have to cherish every day, and you realize that it's not going to go on forever. And if there are these burdens that you're carrying, or if there are things that you want to do, don't put them off. It can rearrange your priorities. And I think that's it is a universal message across many, many traditions, but I think we keep forgetting it, and we just need people to be reminded of it.
Well, and that's why, when we named our podcast, we called it Everyone Dies. And some people said, we love your podcast, but we hate the name of your show. It's like, sorry. I said, we can't dispute it, can we? Well, no, but we don't need to be reminded of it. And I said, well, I think we do. I think we do.
Yeah.
We like to be able to pretend that, some of the stupid things that we do could not result in our death, but they can. And that we'd like to think that putting things off until tomorrow is okay, but all you then do is chew up your tomorrows and you don't actually accomplish things or say the things to the people that we need to say them to. It's, frittering away your life. And that, to me, when I see people doing that, it's just like, damn, you act like you've got 10 billion years, but you don't.
Yep, that's right.
Now, you did a section in the book about realizing mortality, and you said if you avoid things, you give it power. If you let it go, if you let go of the fear, that energy dissipates. Does that sound right? Because, like I told you, I was reading this after surgery. So
it's actually it's a quote. It's in my book. It's a quote from a Zen Buddhist teacher who I got the chance to talk with in Creston, Colorado, and I think that's really true. That by keeping something hidden or suppressed, you actually give it a lot of energy. And it's like a pressure cooker often. The pressure builds up and it can, it come out in a way that you don't want it to come out. But if you acknowledge it, if you face it, then that energy, negative energy, can dissipate from it. And I think, that certainly relates to this idea of facing mortality.
Did you find in your travels or your readings about facing mortality, are there any cultures or groups that kind of embrace it from birth, or is it something that comes later in people's lives?
I think, there are a number of aspects of different cultures that I visited that I think have aspects of that certainly the Day of the Dead traditions from Mexico and in Mexican American communities. I love the Day of the Dead traditions, this idea that once a year the dead come back and you have the chance to honor them and relate to them, but in a celebratory way. Not that, of course, I think there will always be sadness and grief at some level, but there's also this recognition of that the ties of love don't end when someone dies. And so I love the color and the vibrancy and the sort of the quirkiness of Day of the Dead. And so that's one place that I would certainly look to for inspiration. I also, I had mentioned Creston, Colorado, and that was a place I was really fascinated by. It's a very small town.
I love that story about how your car died.
I'm like, it's sort of a mystical car breakdown story.
I mean, did like the hair on the back of your neck stand up when you heard that? No, see, now you have to tell the listeners the story.
Well, Creston, Colorado is a very small town, south central Colorado, and it's really unusual in that it has so many different spiritual centers located there, and that's because in the 1970s there was a wealthy philanthropist couple who came to the area. They bought up a bunch of land, and they made an offer to any spiritual group that wanted to come and establish a center in Creston. They could get the land free of charge. And as a result, the Buddhists came, and the Hindus came, and New Agers, and Christians, and so it's more than 24 spiritual centers of many types that are located in this very, very sparsely populated area. And I went to Creston, and somewhat of a whim. I'd been there briefly a couple of years before, and I was really intrigued by it, but I didn't get the chance to stay very long. So I came back to learn more about Creston, and I thought, maybe might work in this book that I was writing. And I was meeting with the mayor for dinner the first evening, and our car basically died on the way to the restaurant. It lost all power, was just inching along down the street. And so we go into the restaurant and meet the mayor, and there was another person there too, and they were visiting. And then, halfway through the conversation, I mentioned, we need to find some kind of garage who can fix our car. And the guy sort of perked up, and he said, that's interesting. He said, it's like the Taos story. And I said, the Taos story? What's that? And he said, well, in Taos, New Mexico, there's a famous story that when the town founders were they were passing through the area, their wagon broke down, and they were stuck there for a while, and they took it as a sign that that's where they were supposed to be. And the term ever since has been that if the mountain wants you to stay, the mountain will make sure that you can't go anywhere. So we didn't have a wagon, but we had a car. But what was odd about it was that the next day it was fine. And my husband, who's much more of a skeptic than I am, said, well, it's the high altitude, and, he had various explanations for it. But I think it was also the mountain wanted us to stay.
Well, I interpreted it that way. I was waiting for you to say, and so this is where we live now.
Well, Crestone, I love Crestone, but boy, you have to be tough to live in Crestone. It's high, alpine, mountain territory, a lot of winter there. But I do think it's a really fascinating destination. But the thing I learned, though, that first evening at dinner that made me think, too, that I was really led to Crestone for whatever reason was I learned that Crestone has the only non-denominational open-air cremation grounds in the United States. And so it's the American equivalent of burning of bodies on the Ganges in India. Mm-hmm. And it was fascinating to learn about that, to visit the sacred site where they do this. I did not see a cremation when I was there, but I talked to a number of people who had been involved in the setting up of this and, convincing their neighbors that this was a good idea, of people whose loved ones whose bodies had been cremated in this way, and the impact that it has on the community, where it is a very visceral experience when one of their neighbors and friends dies. And I thought that was a profound teaching. And actually, the Buddhist teacher said that. He said that watching a body being consumed by fire is one of the most profound lessons in mortality that any of us can experience. And he said, and this happens multiple times a year in our community. And I just thought that was such an interesting perspective. Talk about a contrast to our general American desire to push thoughts of death away, instead to embrace that final ritual as a community and do it together, and then go back to your life. That's a profound teaching right there.
Didn't you write that everybody has like a branch, and
yes,
everybody puts a branch onto the fire, sort of like helping?
Well,
I thought that was really, really, really interesting.
Yeah, because it's they're part of the process. I think that's what makes it different from observing a cremation in a funeral home, for example, which I have done that too. Of seeing the body go into the crematorium, and that's a very powerful thing too. And I'm not saying I don't think all towns should have an open air cremation ground. That's not my point. I think Crestone is a very particular, unique place. But I do think we can learn from them this idea that these end of life rituals can be much more participatory. They can be more participatory and more creative. In the sense that there's not one right way to do these rituals, but I think they should be communal. They should involve the network of people that the deceased has been in contact with and influenced. We owe that to them. That is a profound way of honoring.
In the old days, they would, people would get together to to dig the hole and,
right.
make the shroud and, and bury the person. We've sort of made it more
professionalized
the aesthetic of it, yes.
Right.
Where, the dead body's not even in your house anymore. That it's in a different building and other people are doing all of that quote unquote work, and we just show up for the end. And I think that also helps us to isolate us from dying and death. Right. Well, I have to tell you that I love talking to you, Lori, and I'm sure our listeners have been fascinated with this. And I want to thank our listeners for spending time with me during the show, Everyone Dies. You can read our blogs and listen to our other podcasts at everyonedies.org. Thank you to our producer, Jeannie White, and our CEO, Lillian Caldwell. We produce a news show every Wednesday to answer questions related to life-threatening illness, dying, and death. Remember, you can listen to Passionate World Radio on Spreaker and our shows wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have a topic you'd like to discuss on our show, please email Marianne at Everyone Dies. That's MARIANNE at EVERY, the number 1, DIES.org. I hope that you live your best life every day, and remember, every day is a gift. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to Passionate World Talk Radio. You can listen to this program all over again by going over to https://passionateworldtalkradio.com. You can also hear it on Spotify, Spreaker, Amazon Alexa, AMFM247.com every Tuesday evening between 8 and 9 p.m. YouTube, Facebook Live, LinkedIn, and all the other podcast directories one can find on the Internet.